Modernist studies and avant-garde and modernist studies are her main field of research interest. She is a specialist in the 20th century Georgian literature and comparative literature, focusing on intercultural contexts. She is a specialist in modernist and avant-garde period and also in the postmodern literature, as well as Soviet period and postcolonial literature. And this is what we will hear now, representation of the Black Sea space in Georgian literature from the postcolonial perspective.
Thank you very much for this very long introduction. Maybe somebody who gave you that introduction was very kind to me, but not very kind to the audience and to you, because this was, I guess, taken from the webpage, so there was all kind of information there. So I'm very pleased and very happy to again welcome you at this conference. A year ago, when we decided that with the lucky idea of Professor Nusolovici that we shall be discussing the Black Sea topic here at this conference, as well as maybe this will become the subject of our future cooperation, we of course had in mind some Georgian texts which are very you can come here if you prefer. Here are two chairs, please. Oh, it's okay then. We all had in mind some certain texts which give very interesting and very strong representation of our attachment, or on the other hand, our disattachment, our distance relations with the Black Sea. So this is still the topic of our analytical activities. But on the other hand, there are some certain texts which give very clear ground for the interpretation of current Georgia's relation to the Black Sea and to the region itself. And this reflects our ideas of belonging to certain integrity. Here we can see that in the 20th century, Georgia was forced to become the part of the Soviet integrity, and the country, the nation, the writers were not happy about this reality. So lots of texts appeared resisting this situation, which tried to create some alternative ideas within the literary space, because of course official cultural space was not that much supportive or was actually against the development of this kind of ideas. There are a few very important texts which give us the ground for discussions, and some of these texts were already addressed by the previous speakers in their brilliant presentations. Yesterday, Tina Mamatsishvili discussed Leo Kiachali's Hagi Atzban. Today, Zal discussed Akamorchiladze's and Tatarchiladze's novels. Both these presentations were brilliant and very detailed, so I decided to redesign my presentation and to give to our international audience more of background, more idea about the background of Georgian literature in the 20th century, which is actually very important while interpreting the texts that are applied here for the interpretation of the Black Sea attachment. So I will be now going more on general tendencies and showing more general shifts from one cultural tendency to another, and later just showing you how these few important prose texts. One of them is novella by Leo Kiachali, and three of them are quite substantial novels, quite solid texts. So I will try how the cultural background and how the cultural paradigm is shifting in the 20th century. So please keep in mind that this is very, a schematic representation of Georgian cultural tendencies in the 19th and 20th centuries. This is the time of the start of the modernity in Georgian Georgian literature and Georgian reality, and on the other hand, this is simultaneously the time of start of colonization of Georgia. So all our current stories start with this document, which cannot be actually blamed for Georgia's colonization. This is the document which prepared the ground for military and political partnership with Russian Empire. But in 1801, so very first year of the 19th century, Russian Empire and Emperor Alexei I, he cancelled the treaty. Actually, he betrayed the treaty and he cancelled the rule of Bagrationi dynasty. So since then, we have the process of resistance to colonial discourse and colonial reality. So let me say that Georgian literature never tolerated this reality, although there was a period in Georgian literature, especially harsh, this period was in Stalin totalitarian times, there was a period which forced Georgian writers to produce the texts tolerating or even praising the Soviet reality. But here we can see that this cultural tendency is the subject of changes, but on the other hand, it consistently keeps Georgian literature's orientation towards the national idea, towards the national problem. So on the early 19th century, we have the strong cultural tendency of Western Romanticism, and which is at the same time addressing the issues of Georgia's colonization by Russia, very strongly addressing these issues. Then in the 19th century, in the 1860s, sorry, we have the strong tendency of realism, and Georgian generation of the 60s under the leadership of Ilia that starts the new cultural paradigm, which is very much realistic, which is very much nation-oriented, and they create the new version of Georgian national identity, and we today are just inheriting their legacy. On the other hand, Georgian modernist cultural paradigm appears in Georgian literature already in the 1910s. Let me say that this is the cultural tendency which is most important to us from today's perspective, because this is the valuable contribution, we believe that this is the valuable contribution into Georgia's development. So let me continue with my written text and paper, and of course we will be able to skip some parts of the text, since I know that some other presenters are in line, so I'm taking some of their time. In Soviet times, Georgian literature is developed under the strict political and cultural directions coming from the Soviet-Russian center. So let me say that Sovietization of Georgia happened in 1921. We had very interesting and very brief period of Georgia's independence. So this is the image of the Sovietization of Georgia in 1921. But before that, we had very brief and very interesting multicultural Georgian modernist avant-garde period, which is marked with important contributions, important journals and book publications by Georgian authors, as well as Russian avant-gardists in exile. This is the topic for another paper, another presentation, but here I just want briefly to mention that Georgian modernists and few Georgian literary groupings, as well as individual authors, in cooperation with Russian avant-gardists, create a unique milieu of Georgian modernism and avant-garde, which continues to inspire today Georgian scholars as well as Georgian writers and poets. But of course, when Georgia announced its state independence on May 26, 1918, the process was very much supportive to cultural developments as well. So we think that on the other hand, Georgian literature and cultural tendencies were itself supportive to the development of democratic atmosphere in Georgia. And here you can see some names of Georgian literary groupings and individual authors who really created very important texts which are valued by Georgians. Some of them were banned by Soviets, or some of them were ignored or extolled from the circulation. But here we can see the names which are today defining 20th century Georgia's cultural heritage. Please keep in mind that this name, Leo Chiacelli, will appear in our presentation later, since he created very important texts concerning Georgia's literary relations and also political address to the Sovietization, Bolshevik empire. In Soviet times, Georgian literature is developed under the strict political and cultural directions coming from the Soviet center. Soviet republics are required to be oriented solely towards the center. The USSR, the multinational, multicultural space unifying Soviet peripheries, is fully dominated by the center. The Soviet space is the only possible area for the political and accordingly cultural integration. Thus, Georgia's political and cultural isolation from the free world is the result of the Soviet colonial policy. While the Soviet state closes the political and cultural borders with the West for all Soviet republics, including Georgia, the special channels and instruments are activated to ensure the central control and involvement in nation's cultural life. Georgian culture, on its turn, tries to create some frames, detach and isolate itself from the center, and achieve preservation of own national cultural values. However, the agenda of isolating itself from the Soviet ideological and cultural influences, being anyway isolated from the desirable Western cultural space, causes the development of the spirit of closeness and isolation of Georgian culture. So when did it start? Actually, it started in the 1920s, but in 1920s, as we may see here, modernist texts are still produced in Georgia, but with the Soviet Writers' Congress, which was already mentioned by Zalan Nikashvili in his presentation, with the Soviet Writers' Congress, the process was really taken under the control of the Soviet center, Soviet Russian center. By the end of the 1920s, Stalin usurped political power while rejecting the idea of world revolution and introducing the possibility of building socialism in one state. Stalin changed Trotsky's rhetoric in relation to culture. Within this new approach, the Soviet state was announced as the place where Marxist and Leninist ideas had taken shape, and absolute justice and happiness for the people was already achieved. So this was main claim done at this Congress. At the same time, the society had to draw a borderline and isolate itself from the hostile capitalist world. Thus, the existence of bourgeois modernist culture, which was already flourishing not only in the Russian capitals but also in Tbilisi, as I mentioned before, this bourgeois modernist culture within the Soviet space could no longer be tolerated. However, the end of 1920s and early 1930s was not yet the time for massive political repressions. The political authorities preferred other solutions, suggesting the possibility of a transfiguration or conversion of formerly modernist artists and writers to a new understanding of art and creativity. The possibility of conversion was given to modernists in accordance with the new policy of inclusion, which was introduced as a replacement to the selective approach of the 1920s. So yesterday, here was a question, I think it was Vera's question, how, for example, Tizian Tabidze, so she had this question based on Jordan's very interesting and very detailed presentation on the Georgian poet, symbolist Tizian Tabidze. So he had a question whether this was the personal choice of Tizian Tabidze to convert to the Soviet poet, or this was kind of grounded on any other reasons. So I definitely say that the whole Georgian modernist generation was forcibly and very aggressively somehow leaving their ideology, their cultural preferences, and forced to switch to that ideological preferences, which were a very hostile ideology for Georgia, and that's why we can say that this was a dramatic already at the First Writers' Congress. The All-Union Congress of Soviet Writers in August-September 1934 was a manifestation of cultural shift to socialist realism. While discussing Leo Chiacelli's novel, we can see how Georgian modernists decided to introduce this shift into Georgian literature. But anyway, this process was politically and ideologically driven and suggested to cultural figures by the political power. Most canonically then, socialist realism was defined in terms of literature. Indeed, for most of the 30s, literature was the flagship of Soviet culture, and the other branches of arts were expected to follow its models. This is no accident. In a decade when the Soviet leadership sought to legitimize and codify its regime, written text assumed enormous significance. This is the quote from Clark and Dobrengo, which provided very careful study of Stalin cultural policy and Stalinism in Soviet Union. Socialist realism was introduced to Soviet writers as a new method and the new aesthetics based on already shaped Soviet ideology. Soviet collectiveness against individualism was suggested as one of the principles, and this was the message primarily for former and still existing modernists. Former modernists had to become now part of of a collectivity, and this was emphasized in formal documents accepted at the Congress. The writers of all people of the USSR, this is the quote from the resolution of the Congress, had to come to their first Congress as a collective body, which in its ideas, organization and creative work has relied around the party and the Soviet power into a single union of the Soviet writers. End of the quote from the resolution of the Congress. This instruction of being converted to socialist rails or being reborn was given to writers of all nationalities. It was the emergence, this is the quote from Robin's study, emergence of Soviet and not simply Russian culture. So definitely we can say that so-called Soviet culture is fully based on the models and approaches and aesthetical principles as well as ideological principles developed in the center, in the Russian imperial center. This is not something what is the result of the free cultural development in national republics. All national republics are forced to follow the model coming from the center. Now, while discussing the famous slogan of socialist realism, Dowi Fokema, distinguished scholar of literature and sociology of literature, assumes that describing reality in its revolutionary development in fact meant to portray that which could be considered as reality as well as that which was not yet reality. So this is Fokema's understanding of the socialist realism. I will add that for me personally, socialist realism can be defined as an illusionary realism. It creates the illusion of reality, but this is not the reality. Lots of dramatic and tragic processes happening in reality, including the Great Purge, never enters the literary space. So literary space is fully detached from the reality, is fully delusional, I would say. So I would say that socialist realism is the aestheticism and ideology which is actually delusional rather than realistic. So the aesthetic tradition of Russian realism was used to picture the reality that was in fact only a product of imagination. Poetry and prose, film, posters, paintings and sculpture, music and theater, together with press and radio, were transformed into a propaganda machine, generating the fake image of the ideally organized, happy Soviet life. Under the utopian surface, the brutal reality was concealed. Literature became part of the official discourse, illustrating officially approved versions of recent history and present, including stories about revolution and Sovietization. The thematic frame was highly restricted. poetic text as well as prose text as well as films should be glorifying, and prose texts were supposed to depict the life of the working class and peasants, and of course tell the stories about the revolution and the Bolsheviks, protest party leaders and the achievements of communism, showing the contrast between troubled life of common people in the past and their happiness in the present. So this long framework for me was necessary to introduce to you the first author to be discussed today. This is Leo Chiacelli. So he is the his fate, his cultural shifts happening in his writings are the direct reflection and illustration of political and ideological problems happening in Georgia, thanks to or not thanks to Russian colonization. Leo Chiacelli was initially a prose writer who developed very deep and very inciting texts, modernist texts, first novellas and short stories, saying the main, showing the main abilities of Georgian prose and Georgian literature to reflect on modernist thematics and modernist problems which are already becoming very topical to Georgia. But already by the end of 20s and early 30s, Leo Chiacelli, as well as other Georgian modernists, is forcibly switching to Soviet rails. Let us see how this switch indeed happened. Actually, Leo Chiacelli develops two very important novellas. One is the Duchess Maya, and another is Hatiatsba, which show the presence of the sea in Georgian reality, in Georgian understanding, and in both cases, sea is the deep matter, is something where the Georgian aristocracy is giving their lives, and actually traditional Georgian reality is being drowned in the sea, as it happens in the Chiacelli's The Duchess Maya, and of course in Hatiatsba. Yesterday, Tina Mamatsashvili very detailed give the very detailed analysis of the Hatiatsba. Let me again go very shortly to the plot. The story or the novella depicts the reality which we have in the capital of Abkhazian province in Georgian town, Sukhumi. So Sukhumi is still very painful topos for Georgians today, but already at that time, this is the part of the country which starts to enjoy democracy, starts to enjoy the self-governance, and starts to be part of the well-developed Western-oriented world. So the story starts, the action, the time frame of the novella is February 1918. So this is the time when Georgia's independence is not announced officially yet, but country is already distanced from the Russian center. Civil war is happening in Russia, and also Black Sea shores are covered by blood. So Leo Chiacelli starts the novel by showing the blood storms covering Black Sea shores, and Russian civil war between Red Army and White Army is already reaching Black Sea. And Sukhumi is, although still apart from this process, which is taking part in Crimea and Russian side of the Black Sea shore, Sukhumi somehow suddenly becomes in the center of the action, since the Bolshevik big military boat reaches Sukhumi. So when we speak about the political situation in Georgia in 1918, let's remember Osip Mandelstam's words, which he said already in 1923 in already Sovietized Georgia, he was saying that this small independent state having emerged out of the bloodshed in other countries, so he had in mind, of course, the Russian Revolution and First World War, tried to be bloodless. So it's very interesting, interesting interpretation, interesting understanding of Georgia's reality, because indeed Georgian Democratic Republic, established in May 1918, was trying to be neutral. It was officially declaring the neutral position, and although Georgia was given a chance of establishing its own nation state as a result of the First World War, of course, and then as a result of Russian Revolution and the collapse of the Russian Empire. So at this moment, of course, Mandelstam is quite correct. Mandelstam was himself visiting Georgia or escaping to Georgia from Russian civil war and Russian Bolshevik flames, and he was hosted by Georgian writers and poets, including Tizian Tabidze, and he, of course, was supposed to be grateful to this to Georgians, but then in 1923 he wrote this essay, Mensheviki in Gruzi, Mensheviks in Georgia, which was not really appreciated by Georgian symbolists. They didn't like the things that Mandelstam said about Georgian literature, but the only thing he said was that Georgian modernists had to be more oriented towards Georgian traditions and traditional realist literature. Let's keep in mind Mandelstam's position, and let's see how this position is, for example, understood by the generation of Georgian modernists. But anyway, Mandelstam was saying that Hamilton, by menacing forces, it aspired to enter history as a clean and thriving state, to become something like a new Switzerland, a neutral piece of land, innocent from birth. So this is how Sohumi looks exactly in Leochiachali's story, Hakiatska. Sohumi was enjoying this the free local government. In some crisis they are supposed to call Tbilisi, they are planning to call Tbilisi, but before that they invite all the representatives of city council as well as political parties to decide how to react to the crisis which is created since the Bolshevik military boat is reaching the city. Actually, we cannot go in a very detailed explanation of the plot of the story, but let me say that the story is started with Black Sea image, which is shed by blood, and the blood is reaching also Georgian territories, and in the end of the story, 3 bodies are drowned in the Black Sea. One body of Russian matros, Russian sailor, another body of Georgian aristocrat, and the third person who really decided to commit suicide and to kill himself is the servant and so-called brother of the Georgian aristocrat who is killed by Bolsheviks. So anyway, we can say that the military boat of Bolsheviks brings to country death, and it destroys existing order, and it kills all the hopes that Georgian Democratic Republic had at that moment. So definitely the story is very dramatic, and definitely the story is not prizing Bolshevism at all. But in Soviet times, Bolshevik literary critics started interpreting this story like this. And still this is the part of official interpretation of the story. So in my dialogue with Tina Mamatsashvili, we really said that these kind of interpretations are still here in our books, which are on our shelves. So our students may take those books from the shelves and may reproduce these Bolshevik ideas which come from the 1930s even without knowing this. They even cannot recognize these ideologized moments while discussing this, while following these interpretations. So let me say that Hakiatsba was definitely very misinterpreted in Soviet times, because one of the jobs of Soviet literary criticism was misinterpretation of texts written by Georgian modernists. Leo Chiacelli, as former Georgian modernist, he develops the text which is actually not a prize to Soviet regime, not a compromise to the socialist realists, but the text which reveals the whole evil nature of Bolshevism and which uses the aesthetical resource of realism and not modernism to achieve its own artistic goals and its own national agenda. So let me say that Georgian writers started working in this format. So a whole generation of Georgian modernists started to develop the aestheticism of realism and not socialist realism. This was not actually that delusional realism, socialist realism. It was true classical way of realism in which they started revealing the Soviet evil face of the Soviet regime, but sometimes this was not fully understood by Soviet critics and Soviet officials, but sometimes it was understood. Leo Chiacelli survived the Great Purge, while some other very important Georgian modernists, also creating the text based on this cultural paradigm, did not. For example, Mikhail Javakhishvili did not survive the purge, as well as Tbilisi, but Leo Chiacelli was even decorated by the Soviet regime. When thinking about this situation, I keep in mind always Donald Dreyfield's explanation. Donald Dreyfield is a British scholar of Georgian literature, and he says that Stalin and Beria, as Calvinian gods, they were selecting some writers to be destroyed physically as well as morally, and they were selecting some other writers, including Leo Chiacelli or Galaktion Davidze, for example, to be prized by the Soviet regime and to become the cultural figures showing the Sovietization, showing the idea of Sovietization of Georgian literature. But anyway, Leo Chiacelli remained in Georgian literary canon even after the end of Soviet official literary control. I would say that Hatiatzba was indeed part of the literary canon, and this was the text introduced already at schools to Soviet children, for me, for example. But at that time, we could really tell that this is the text which is not only about positive representation of Bolshevism. This is the text which shows definitely the whole evil nature of the Bolsheviks, and Black Sea here is the sphere of integrity, and this is the sphere from which the threat comes to Georgia. So let's keep in mind that in the 20th century we have few texts where the sea is the space of insecurity. So this is the space from which the unknown and hostile military power comes to the country, and this power will be destroying soon Georgia's existing order and killing its hopes. So this is something what Leo Chiacelli's story shows us, and this is something what is very important for us to keep in mind. But on the other hand, when we think about the way how this story was, on one hand, the part of Soviet literary canon, and on the other hand, this was the really revealing story, we can apply to the concept developed again by Dewi Fogema, saying that there can be the notion like the socio-code, which can give us the instrument of understanding some very interesting relations between the writers and its readers. So Dewi Fogema says that socio-code is the complex of markers and signs which are being interpreted by the writers belonging to the same community which which are interpreted by the readers, and these readers belong to the same community, same social group as the writers. This may be definitely said about Georgian literature of this time. We can say that at this time the certain cultural area, the certain cultural space is developed, which I try to describe as a Georgian national narrative culture. I'm sorry, I have to find my slides. So this is national narrative culture, but before this, let's keep in mind the characteristics of the official Soviet culture. So official Soviet regime, as we saw in 1930s, created the whole well-established and very well supported, I mean budgetary support, as well as the support by repressive machine. So this official Soviet culture is developed from the Russian center. It's supported financially from the Russian center, and of course it's also supported by the repressive machine. So if the writer do not want to follow this official Soviet cultural paradigm, the writer has to pay. So in the Stalin period, the writer paid by means of their own lives. But in post-Stalin period, there were still instruments to keep this culture strong and to keep this budgetary support as well as some kind of administrative support very much oriented towards the official Soviet culture. So the Soviet state is really creating the cultural space which is aesthetically based on socialist realism. This is very normative culture and no experimentation is allowed here, of course, and the political belonging to the Soviet space and belonging to the party literature as it was defined in the 1930s is still very active till the very collapse of the Soviet Union. But since we mentioned that Georgian literature tried to somehow resist to this reality, Georgian writers indeed succeeded in developing another cultural space which is opposite to the official Soviet cultural space. So you may see that all characteristics are oppositional. This is a dominant culture instead of Soviet official culture in post-Stalin period in 1960s and 70s and 80s. We may say that national narrative culture is becoming the dominant culture in Georgia. Please give me a second, I have to follow my... So, in post-Stalin period, the thorough cultural policy made it possible to resist to the official, actually dominating cultural style of socialist realism, and this also means that the resistance to the power banning the sovereignty of nation, since that cultural style was the manifestation and the weapon of that power. In Soviet and Eastern Bloc countries, the thorough cultural period is related with the appearance of new names, new generation, return of individualism in culture. However, it's interesting to observe the role of national narrative culture in this period of the collapse of the USSR. But before that, let us go back to the national narrative culture in the Soviet times. So, national narrative culture in the Soviet period is indeed creating some possibilities for the generation of poets and prose writers to invent a new model of collective self, no longer connected with the Stalinist model of Soviet people. So officially in Stalin period, the model of the Soviet people was the only existing model also practiced in Georgian literature. But after the thaw and after the relevant freedom given to literature, the situation changed and Georgian writers are the mostly important cultural figures who would be appreciated for this. They emphasize, these writers and poets, emphasize in their poetry the national belonging of Georgian people, which should be seen as a separate from the Soviet collective self. These poems and prose writings intensify the feeling of personal identity and thus allow the reader to feel his or her own personality within the national sphere, not to be impersonalized in the Soviet no-national conglomeration. Personal and national identification was opposed to impersonalization and denationalization suggested from the Soviet center. National self-determination was comprehended as a possibility of personal self-determination. Literature could indeed provide I quote Anthony David Smith now, a powerful means of defining and locating individual selves in the world. So definitely Georgian literature in post-Stalin period managed to relocate Georgian nation in this wider picture of the world literature and develop a strong sense of national identity. As Natividad Gutierrez says, nations cannot survive without cultural history. One of the most deeply rooted collective emotions is a people's defense of self-determination. Creativity, artistic and literary movement, as well as people's sensibility to achieve and preserve independence, reflect a capacity to discover, reconstruct, depict or invent a distinctive collective self. We can definitely say that Georgian poets like Muhran Majavariani, Burman Lebanidze, Anna Kalandadze, Shota Nishnianidze, as well as prose writers including Levan Botua and Otar Giladze, whose novels are mostly interesting for us at this moment, really they achieve in discovering new collective self for Georgians, and this image is definitely based on Georgia's past, not present and not the future, because present and the future is very dim and very vague concept in that period, but Georgian past is applied mostly to revive the collective self of Georgian peoples. Poems and novels have a clear national aspiration, and they earn great social power in this period, and they influenced public moods and affections. So major literary texts are developed by these authors, and it's very important to see how the authors, how these poets and prose writers develop the imagery, national imagery for Georgians. Since the Soviet ideology strictly prohibited religious discourses, national ideas were presented as the most important values. Georgian poetry was equating the idea of serving the nation with that of serving the absolute truth. So Georgian poets and prose writers were telling people that if you serve your nation, and your nation is something distinct from the Soviet people, you have your own national history, and if you serve this national history, then you are serving the truth. This is the absolute truth. On the whole, Georgian poets were trying to portray in their poems the most respected individuals of Georgian history. Suffering heroes as Dimitri Tavdadebuli, Ketevan Zavebuli, Kevzorevdeli, and kings, Vakhtang Gorgasali, David Amashenebeli, Tamar, Mepe, Queen Tamar, and Mepe Eregle. And also these included archetypal places, Mtsketa, Uplistike, Vardzia, and landscapes. Of course, Caucasioni is the major landscape here, and not the Black Sea. So let's keep in mind that while creating the national imagery, Caucasioni mountains are major pillar of this imagery instead of Black Sea. So this was very well discussed by previous plenary speakers, Alan and Nigashvili, so I will not go to this anymore, but here comes to our perspective the novel by Levan Gotua. He is a prominent Georgian writer, prose writer. He writes historic novels, and most of his, one of his most important and most well-known historic novel is The Sorrow of Heroes. I think that this title can be translated like this, but now we want to suggest you to think about his novel Mithridates. This is a novel produced in 1970, and Levan Gotua died without completing the novel. Only first volume, only first book was published, which is still interesting for us, and some manuscripts preserve some parts of the second book, which is not fully developed and not completed yet. But before we say a few words about this novel, let's keep in mind the personal biography of Levan Gotua. He is the writer who was one of the victims of Stalin repressive machine. He spent decades in the exile in Siberia. First, he was arrested and sent to the camp at the age of 16 in 1920s for being active against Sovietization of Georgia. And second time, he spent more than a decade in 40s and 50s in the Soviet concentration camp. He returned to Georgia, but before returning to his home country, he started developing that historic novel, The Sorrow of Heroes, in the camp. So he and his friends were very supportive to him while he was using all small pieces of paper to write down his novel, and these papers were then smuggled by the other prisoners and sent to Tbilisi to his family, and they were then kept until his return to Georgia. It's very interesting to think why Levan Gotua applied to Georgian history instead of telling stories about Soviet camps. So we know other moments when, for example, Solzhenitsyn or tried to depict the reality of the Soviet camps, and he contributed to the development of resistive spirit to Soviet reality, to Soviet camps. Was Levan Gotua that much resistant to Soviet ideology? I would say that from the perspective of Georgian nation, he was indeed resistant. He was indeed trying to create or recreate some alternative history, some alternative stories. I wouldn't say alternative history, sorry, that's not the concept to be applied right now, because later we will need the same concept when discussing Kaka Morchiladze's novel. But in this case, Levan Gotua was creating alternative stories of Georgian national development, alternative to Soviet colonial discourse, the discourse of the colonizer. So Soviet central discourse of the colonizer was suggesting that Georgian nation's happy times begin when the Sovietization happens, but Levan Gotua was taking Georgians back to their historical memories, and he recreates this story, which was quite well forgotten in Georgian imagery. This is the story of Mithridates VI, or the Great. He was the king of Pontus kingdom, and in 1935 to 1963 BC, he was also known as Mithridates the Great, and Eupator Dionysius. He was king of Pontus and Armenia Minor in northern Anatolia and today's Cappadocia. So how Georgians could contribute to the existence of that Pontus kingdom? Georgian sub-ethnic groups actually were, historians say that they were conquered by Mithridates. But Levan Gotua develops the story in which the Kolkis, these groups and sub-ethnic groups of Georgian ground, create very strong power in the kingdom, and they are very strongly resisting the empire. So which empire is this? Historically, this is the Roman Empire. The Mithridates is well known for his redoubtable and successful struggle against Roman Empire. During 55 decades, during 50 years, he struggled against Roman Empire, and Levan Gotua tells us the story in this very solid historic novel, how Mithridates was fighting against Romans. Let's now keep in mind that Roman Empire is not something what is really topical for Georgians at that moment, but there is another empire, which is Russian Empire, which is the problem with Russian Empire is very topical. So let's keep in mind that empire is still the notion used to the Soviet reality in Georgian understanding as well as in Western scholarship. So Western scholarship today widely identifies Soviet Russia as an empire. So Levan Gotua, as well as few other important Georgian writers, including Konstantin Gamsakhourdia, of course, who tells the story of the resistance towards the Byzantine Empire in his very important historic novel Vidas Dadis Margina, as well as Otar Giladze later will apply to the allegory of Greeks as an empire, So they all have the concrete method, which can be called as allegoric method or metaphoric representation of empire. And of course, under the veil of these empires, Russian Empire can be seen. So we can definitely say that Levon Gotwa, as well as all other Georgian writers applying to the problem of empire in this period, are resisting to the colonial discourse, colonial reality, to the discourse of the colonizer. I think that I think I already. Sorry, I will be cutting short my presentation, just mentioning very briefly Otar Giladze's novel. A man was going down the road. This novel was already discussed by Zalan Lunikashvili here at this conference, so I won't be speaking too much about this novel since the same model of allegorization is applied here, and Greeks, in this case, based on Argonaut's myth, are seen as an allegory of Russian Empire. So this is someone who is tricky. This is someone, the Greeks in this novel, and of course we could read Russia in this case. This is someone who comes as a friend and then takes something what is most valuable for us. The golden fleece becomes the symbol of Georgia betrayed by the empire. And this is definitely not the Greeks and not the Byzantine Empire, not the Roman Empire. This is definitely the Russian Empire. So this reality is something what was never tolerated by Georgian writers. Let me say that colonization of Georgia was never tolerated. Of course, later some problems of hybridity and isolation and ambivalence showed up. But we must say that in this period, in this Soviet period, the national narrative culture is most important pillar for preserving Georgian national identity. Of course, this is the imperial period. This is the period of colonized nation, and many kind of controversial problems are related to this national narrative culture. But let me assure you that this controversy became more tangible in post-Soviet times rather than in Soviet times. So in post-Soviet times, that's why very important contemporary Georgian writer Akamur Chiladze creates his novel Santa Esperanza, which gives us the alternative and fictitious, of course, version of Georgia's history. What if Georgians survived Ottoman and Persian empires and Russian Empire? What if they have established the island in the sea, in the Black Sea, and what if they escaped this political domination of Russian colonial center, Russian metropolis, and what if instead became the subaltern to another Western empire, which is in this case British Empire. So Akamur Chiladze, he definitely creates fictitious Georgia in this novel, which is situated in the island within the Black Sea. It's a multicultural country, the country which realized all dreams that Georgians might have in Soviet times and also in post-Soviet times, because novel is produced in 2004. This is the time when Georgia suffered not only from the Soviet reality, but also from the post-Soviet decade, post-Soviet reality, which was very difficult and very stressful for Georgia because of the low economy, because of the civil conflicts, because of the political disorder. So Akamur Chiladze's this novel can be seen as a response of post-Soviet writer to the trauma of colonization and Sovietization, as well as to the trauma of the post-Soviet disorder, which was very harsh to Georgia. So I know that our the next presenters are here and they cannot go to their room because of me. Very sorry if I somehow took an advantage of time, but now I will be finishing my paper and hoping that these discussions about Georgian literature and the image of the sea, and sea as a space of integrity, Black Sea as a possible space of future cultural integration, can be further discussed by our colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Bela, for this very large and very interesting presentation with lots of insights and lots of material for the future debate. And I think we should allow us time for discussion, because we cannot skip this paper without commenting or asking questions about it. Because there are some certain central methodological points. And I guess are there any questions in the audience? Otherwise, I would take the advantage of my position. Thank you very much for this very interesting arrangement of these important texts. What I would ask, this is something that deals with this dichotomical model between Soviet and nation. Because I sensed a little contradiction between this frame and the text, for example, Hagiaspa, which is a very highly interesting text, as you showed it in detail. And you said quite rightly that Hagiaspa is one of the texts which shows the Russian nation of the Russian and Bolshevik occupation, and afterwards Mitridata follows, which is and Otarchivadze, which is in the same line, and the founding text is Agarites Medea, who was the first one to introduce this political reading of the sea-born occupation. But there is one interesting point, which because one interesting point which shows maybe small misplaced.
Yes.
For the Soviet ideology, or for Stalin himself, sometimes not the glorification was the main interest, but the main interest of his favorite play, strangely enough, was not something which we would regard as Soviet now, but Bulgakov's White Guard. White Guard, which was interesting for him because it shows the decay of the old. So when the old dies, it is better than to glorify Stalin himself, for him. And this is something which Leo Chiacheli does, and also Konstantin Inausapurdia does. Because in Tavaris Kalimaya, so Princess Maya and Haki Atspa and Konstantin Inausapurdia and Boris Motatseva and the abdiction of the moon, they show how this old aristocracy degenerates and dies. Yeah? Right? So he has this kind of also this very welcomed party narrative. Right? So what I would stress is this kind of ambivalence between simultaneously being national on one side and showing this occupation, and on the other hand to show, that the old Georgia is dead. It doesn't exist anymore. And maybe just a small comment. And maybe this would show us the ambivalence between what you described, the national Georgian discourse in the Soviet period, and simultaneously the Sovietness of the same discourse, right?
Well, thank you very much for that very deep question. Definitely decay of the aristocracy is shown in this text, but this is not something which is solely invented by socialist realism, Soviet ideology. Decay of the aristocracy is the part of modernist themes and modernist narratives. So it starts from French symbolism, and then it continues with, of course, Oswald Spengler's famous text, which shows the decay of Europe. And definitely decay of the aristocracy on one hand is the part of modernist cultural tendency, showing this. There is another very important text, which also shows the decay of Georgian aristocracy. And this is very much in line with modernist problematics. So, but if we remember Valery Brusov's very important text, in this text, Valery Brusov already says that we have to be blamed, modernists have to be blamed for this decay, and some barbarian force, the Huns, will be coming and destroying us, and we deserve this because we could not be strong enough, we could not support ourselves, we could not protect our values, and we deserve to be destroyed. So this was the decay of the aristocracy is indeed the problem, also reflected in Leo Chiacelli's works. And when he addresses the problem, he is not only following the Soviet model, he is following the cultural tendency of modernist, European modernism and Georgian modernism. But somehow this decay of the aristocracy is in line with the Soviet agenda. For example, Mikhail Javapishvili also in his Javovsky's Nabi shows the decay of Georgian aristocrat. This is something that Georgian writers definitely show as a problem of Georgian nation, because they could not be strong enough to protect themselves. They could not be, they didn't have enough strong will to protect their national values, as Teimuras Kalistavi's character shows us. So this is on one hand in line with Soviet priorities, and that's why Stalin did like it. But on the other hand, the revealing nature of this text is still there.
You have a question?
Yeah, I have maybe a short question. Thank you very much for your presentation, of course, and it's about the starting point of presentation where you was mentioning that in Russian Empire, literature became like milestone of resistance, yeah, towards imperialism.
In Russian Empire, in 19th century, as well as in Soviet Empire.
Could it be explained in case of 19th century, especially by the lack of political resistance of culture or lack of political culture?
That is exactly how Gita Apashin, the famous Georgian critic, explains. He says that since the nation in the 19th century under the Russian imperial law was deprived the right or opportunity to establish own national institutions like research or universities or political parties, that's why the only possible space for self-expression was literature, and that's why it's not surprised that exactly literature and poetry was developed. But this is how it happened. So also in Soviet times, all institutions were Sovietized, and only literature and especially poetry was left as a relevantly free space for self-expression. That's why it continues to carry that mission.
Yeah, but I was actually asking that maybe this is of course the lack of official institutions that is actually the consequence of colonization.
Political culture.
But maybe it happened because there was aristocracies that we had at the time. For example, like Alexander Chavchavadze or Ilia Chavchavadze and so on. Their discourse of resistance was more appropriate to literature because they were more strong in this part of activities and political discourse. That maybe they were not thinking in modern terms of their time. So.
I would say that between Alexander Chavchavadze and Ilia Chavchavadze there is a big difference. Ilia Chavchavadze is the person to whom we shall be grateful for developing the enough culture, the social culture of political development. So political parties, as developed in Georgia since the 80s and 90s, owe very much to the activities of generation of the 1860s. But this is the subject of another discussion, so I wouldn't like to keep the audience very much here about this while discussing these topics. But definitely, Ilia Chavchavadze's generation created the atmosphere of political diversity and political parties which appeared in Georgia and which then resulted in establishment of free democratic republic are indeed the result of his discursive activities. discourse of resistance in Ilia Georgiadze's public essays was so strong that this was the ground for the political freedom in Georgia.
Excuse me, there was a question. Please. Yes. Please.
Just excuse my ignorance. I want to just find out, during this period, which is paradigmatic before the rise of nationalist literature,
yes.
During the Free Republic and so forth, were there members of this avant-garde who were leaning towards Dada and Surrealism? Could you say what happened to them? Did they follow the same course or not?
So, actually, since you mentioned the avant-garde in Georgia, this is one of my favorite topics, but I wouldn't be very precise in discussing this. Maybe later I can give you some links to the materials which will show that. If you go to the website modernism.g, you can find some very interesting journals and books published in Georgia in the period of Free Georgian Democratic Republic, which are related with avant-garde, and they are produced in cooperation with Russian avant-gardists and Georgian symbolists and avant-gardists. Later, after the Sovietization, Russian avant-gardists left the country, but Georgians continued to produce their texts, and in 1923, Georgian avant-garde group H2SO4 was established. This is the name of sulfuric acid, as you may remember from chemistry, and they were saying that we are destroying old literature as well as sulfuric acid is destroying everything old and old-fashioned. So the group carried their activities for just a few years after Stalin banned avant-garde in Russian center as well as in Georgia. And the status of the group can be seen as a combination of futurism, Italian futurism and Russian futurism, and Dadaism. So Dada is definitely here, but Surrealism never really enters Georgia. So what happened to the group? The group shared the fate of other Georgian modernists and avant-gardists, other Soviet modernists and Sovietized modernists and avant-gardists. One of them was executed, another of them became prominent Soviet critic, most harsh Soviet and most, Orthodox Soviet critic. One of them became, Simon Chikovani became, so Besoshventi is that Soviet critic, and Django Bababeridze is the one who was executed, and Simon Chikovani switched to realist rails, not socialist realist rails, the delusional realist which I discussed in my paper, but to realism, to national discourse.
I just wanted to thank you for this very interesting presentation, and I would admit that I've missed that point that you have just made about Argo being viewed by the author as the extended image or extended symbol of the Soviet onslaught, the Soviet Empire. I will be discussing also this writer in my presentation in regards and in relation, in connection with Ulitskaya.
Yes, I know.
And thank you for this point. I will take it into account.
Thank you so much. So there was one more question, I guess, and then we shall be.
Do you agree with the concept of subversive literature to describe that literature that you presented?
The concept of subversive literature. No, I can agree or disagree, but which text do you have in mind in this case? Okay, it can be seen definitely as a subversive literature. It's very much technically based on postmodernist artistic techniques, and Akaborchiladze is the writer, which is not very artificial in this case. He is a very talented writer, and that's why he makes the process of reading the text very enjoyable. It's really intellectual pressure
pleasure to follow his text. But on the other hand, his text became very popular in Georgia. Maybe his other novels, rather than this one, Santa Esperanza, which is quite sophisticated novel. So he's his texts are much more approachable when he depicts his subculture of Georgian prestigious district Bake in his previous novels. But Santa Esperanza is definitely very sophisticated and very artistically successful texts, in which, of course, this alternative fictitious Georgia is a way of subversing Georgia's reality and Georgia's past as well as present. You have
yes, thank you. I don't know, my reaction is perhaps really naive. Excuse me for that, please. I understood the Georgian identity, or a part of the Georgian identity, as a resistance against Soviets. And I wondered if there were ways to, or if the writers and intellectuals were searching relationships with other countries around the Black Sea, and to remind of our thematic here, literal space, and because I think in resistance it could be possible to search allied.
Yes, I understand your question. Thank you so much. That's not your question at all. That is very deep question indeed. But let me say that I'm not assuring you that national resistance and national literature was the only form of literature in Soviet times. Of course, official Soviet literature, which I described, was also produced in large volumes, and it was supported by the budget. It was actually the official norm to produce this kind of Soviet text, Soviet-spirited text. But let me assure you that in post-Stalin period, this official Soviet culture became a facade, and beyond them the action was going on. Beyond this, the national texts were being happened. I have compared this to the double coding. So Georgian literature indeed started to double code itself. So on one hand, very compromising texts were produced by the same poets, for example, by the same authors, who could on the other hand produce very nationally minded texts. So, but on the other hand, you asked about the possibilities of interaction with the rest of the world. And let me assure you that these possibilities was completely impossible for Georgian writers. There was the metaphor of the Iron Curtain. It's not just a metaphor. It's very well designed policy how to restrict Georgian writers or writers in the national republics from the possibilities and opportunities of seeking any kind of contact with the rest of the world. So when I was a young student, for example, any kind of contact with Turkey any kind of cultural contact was completely impossible. And if you was planning and trying to travel to Turkey, you had to obtain the permission from the Soviet Center, first travel to Moscow, and then try to go to Istanbul or Ankara. But on the other hand, Bulgaria and Romania were somehow more approachable spaces, but still this approach was only possible through the central control. So it was not a kind of free choice. I will travel to Sofia, for example, and read Bulgarian writers. This was very much controlled Soviet planned visits of the writers to other countries, only as a member of the delegations, and of course KGB agents were the supervisors of the delegations, and no free communication could happen there. So that's the Iron Curtain was definitely a very tangible thing and not a metaphor for Georgia. So
maybe the last question.
To follow on the same question, I think the idea of a literary space has to be very objective, has to be very neutral. It's not only paradise.
Yes.
It could be hell.
It's not a paradise. Yes,
it could be hell.
Yes.
So, just as kind of hypothesis, could we consider during the Soviet period all the countries being submitted to this dogma of socialist realism to form a literary space? Because even if it's a dogma, each cultural and each literature was answering to this request with its own resources.
Yes.
Cultural, literary, memorial, and so on and so forth. So maybe, once again, as an hypothesis to work on, maybe all the literature submitted to this dogma of social realism during the Soviet period could be considered as a kind of literary space.
Yes, it is a literary space, definitely. There are literary texts, very, sometimes quite ambivalent literary texts, which can be, again, very revealing or very compromising to the Soviet regime. It's definitely a literary space with its own principle, with its own paradigmatic models, which are very interesting to be analyzed.
That goes back to what you didn't do, that means the post-colonial reading.
Yes.
If we go back to Omi Baba, this kind of resistance, mimetic, and so on and so forth, I think we should apply that to the Soviet period and the national literature.
I skipped the quote by Kobi Baba. I'm afraid I didn't have enough time for going on this concept, but definitely Georgian literature was trying to find own symbolic citizenship, and this symbolic citizenship was not definitely Soviet citizenship. They were creating their own national symbolic citizenship, but at that moment they were deprived of the opportunity to be integrated with the desirable Western space. So this was unfortunately very isolated symbolic citizenship, and this isolation is still visible in Akaborchiladze's novels, since everything happens on the islands, isolated islands, which are difficult to reach and which are controlled from the seashore and not from the island, center of the island.
Maybe a small comment on this. There is a very famous Georgian short story which is called A Man Who Loved Literature Very Much, where the protagonist, who is a photographer and not a scholar of literature or not a writer, he finds this escape space in literary sense in the space of literature.
Definitely.
And this space of literature is the space of world literature. So it's not Georgian, not Soviet, it's world literature. Also, he reads texts from, I don't know, from Nigeria to Norway, and but this is also problematic. So it's not straightforward, but the literary space is an alternative space to the Soviet space.
Thank you, Zanikov, so much for remembering that. I actually have a chapter of that short story in my book, but I never remembered to mention this because Bela, which was discussed brilliantly by Levan Zagarelian on our previous session, as well as Guram Dochenashvili, they create a possibility of escaping from Soviet reality through literature. And this is world literature as much as this is approachable. For example, Caribbean authors, Latin American authors are already approachable. Classical Western authors are still approachable, and Georgian modernists are more or less approachable after the ban. So Guram Dochenashvili as well as Givi Margvelashvili did try to escape, and this is literary space where they escape. So the last question, I'm afraid we have to cut short now. It wasn't really short, but...
three things.
Yes,
the first thing is that unfortunately I tried to found obviously he's not translated in English.
Yes.
He is much translated in English now and also in German. So he was
in German. Yes, I find it in German, but not in English. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, he is translated, but maybe he's not on Amazon or something, but I will find out.
Okay. The second thing is that in '64, I think, in Bulgaria, one of the first novel which escapes from socialist realism is Vera Mutavcheva, it is an historical novel.
Yep.
So it's a historical novel as a way to escape from this dogma is something interesting.
I will be definitely searching on that topic. So thank you very much, and maybe later I will write
yes,
down
we can speak. And the last thing, don't you think that we spoke this day about postmodernisms with S, and now with realism socialist. The socialist realisms.
Yes.
Don't you think it would be interesting in the next years to speak about them as literary spaces of Black Sea, of the Black Sea?
Definitely. In each country, I hope, except Turkey, socialist realism was very strong cultural tendency. It was strong by means of production, as well as products which were really produced as a result of the pressure. So the strength was based on state policy instead of free cultural policy. And definitely, at least 5 countries of the Black Sea region share this experience. Maybe someday we shall be organizing a panel about the socialist realism in Black Sea countries. Thank you very much for that idea. As well as postmodernism, of course, in Black Sea.